As if in a nightmare, on a hillock under a dark sky stood a creature pierced by a spear, from a distance resembling a man, but hiding a different essence inside itself. It was unclear why this guy was here, the only person who walked straight towards the wounded giant, as if he felt no fear. Henry looked up at this giant, who could scare anyone, but for some reason he couldn't take his eyes off him and remained in place. This creature with a dark aura looked back at Henry, and it was unclear what it wanted and how their meeting would end. It was so huge that Henry seemed like a bug, because the mutant's leg alone was several times taller than a human's height. Taking a closer look, the boy realized with horror that it was incredibly similar to him, as if it were Henry in the guise of a monster. At some point, he realized that this was not a nightmare at all, and that he might have already died, and could now be right in hell. It was hard to understand how this was possible and who this monster was. But instead of killing the guy, he just stood and silently looked at him. Then, looking around, Henry could not remember the place where he was, and, it seemed, found himself in this gloomy desert for the first time. At that moment, a heavy drop of blood fell on his shoulder, and it could only belong to one person. Looking up, Henry only now saw that the mutant was wounded, but in what battle he received this wound and who inflicted it. Suddenly his eyes flashed white and he said something about heroic souls. But Henry still didn't understand why these words were said. Then the monster let out a loud roar with such hatred that the guy was ready to accept his fate and die in an unequal battle right then and there. But suddenly he noticed that the huge spear with which the giant was pierced reminded Henry too much of his own weapon. Could it really be a coincidence? And the monster roared so loudly that the guy's face became covered in sweat from fear, but he already realized that the bright light brought salvation, not death. A second later, he dissolved into thin air, and in the place where Henry stood next to the mutant, only this creature remained. Meanwhile, life at the academy went on as usual. The weather was wonderful, and the kids tried to get some fresh air during breaks. However, for a girl named Julia, the president of the disciplinary committee, the day did not go well from the very beginning. After all, the girl had drunk too much tea in the morning and, it seemed, could no longer hold back, and it was too far to run to the toilet. Taking a quick look around and making sure that no one was around, Julia decided not to wait and do her business right where she was. Of course, she simply had no choice, and anyone in her place could have found themselves in the same awkward situation. Finally, choosing the moment, Julia realized with relief that this little problem, which always arose at the wrong time, was solved for her, and her torment was over. But suddenly, on the right, an interdimensional gate opened, from which poured the very light that Henry saw in front of him at the last second. Coming out of the gate, Henry realized that he was in another dimension, and now all that was left was to find out where he had ended up this time. For the first few seconds he couldn't understand where he was, because after such a quick move it took time to come to his senses. And as luck would have it, the guy found himself in that very secluded place where Julia was sitting, and her whole face was burning with shame, because a second ago, there was no one there. Many years ago, when humanity was at the peak of its development, armies of ancient monsters rose from their graves, instilling fear in defenseless inhabitants. But it was the Eastern cultivators and Western magicians who had been hiding from people for thousands of years who were now returning to Earth one after another. All countries then realized the importance of these immortals, capable of fighting mutants, and the authorities began a special policy towards their saviors. As a result, many academies had departments for cultivators, where they were supposed to train warriors to protect humanity from aliens. As a result, these people did not unite against the evil spirits, but only showed their greed, and the number of monsters increased every day. It was Henry who found the priceless treasure that was the Hall of Heroic Souls, and from that day on, the wise Empress became his mentor. Great warriors of the past and present became servants of the Soul Hall, but because of its power, the main forces were always afraid of Henry and eventually ambushed him. To protect his mentor, he had to stand alone against a horde of monsters, because no one except Henry could save her from death. To do this, he called upon all the heroic souls at once, loudly asking them to appear and help him in the fight against evil spirits. Yes, this guy was ready to single-handedly protect not only his young mentor, but also the entire human race, seeing this as the meaning of his life. One of the gods was the first to respond to Henry's call and was ready to join the fight with him, not allowing the boy to bear this burden alone. However, in the end, after a bloody battle, Henry's side was still unable to win, and they were wiped off the face of the earth, losing this terrible duel. The battle was so fierce that energy waves, similar to the impact of a meteorite, spread from the battle site across the entire planet. As a result, there was nothing left of the world, and the guy understood that he really died. but how could he be reborn after his death? Suddenly, he saw the familiar tower of the Cultivation Academy where he studied in his youth, and remembered that in his past life it was destroyed by demons. Looking at his watch and seeing the date, he realized that he had somehow managed to go back in time to the moment when he was 18 years old. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound behind him and turned around sharply, out of habit thinking that it was another monster. But instead of the mutant, he suddenly saw Julia in front of him, who was hastily trying to put on her underwear, not having time to tidy herself up in front of this guy. Surprisingly, this did not embarrass Henry at all, and he greeted his classmate, whom he had not seen for many years, with a smile. But judging by the poor girl's face, she was not at all happy about this meeting and was ready to sink through the ground from shame. At that moment, loud voices of students were heard nearby, who had been looking for Julia throughout the academy for a long time. The boys were sure that they heard her voice, and, deciding that she was in trouble, were ready to save her. And the girl suddenly grabbed Henry and demanded that he immediately shut up until the students went the other way. Of course, the guy didn't resist, although it was strange why this strongest student of the academy was behaving so cowardly. Meanwhile, Julia kept a close eye on the students, wanting only for them to leave this place as soon as possible. When she was sure they were already far away, she turned to Henry and asked what he wanted to tell her. But first, the guy asked her to adjust her underwear, which she had put on so awkwardly in a hurry that it was visible from under her skirt. It is unlikely that the girl will be pleased with such a remark, and Henry is lucky that he remained alive after these offensive words. He had been badly beaten and now he was nervously smoking one cigarette after another, having received several slaps from an angry classmate. Taking his advice and adjusting her underwear, Julia asked the guy's name, which she didn't know, although Henry thought they had known each other for a long time. In response, he gave his name and said that he had no chance to attend cultivation classes due to his parents' poverty and poor academic performance. The girl was surprised by his answer, because it meant that he was from a different faculty, and perhaps did not even know her real name. But the guy happily replied that he knew her very well, because Julia, as the president of the disciplinary committee, was known to all the students. But Henry misunderstood her, and she, throwing him a look full of hatred, asked again whether he knew her name or had never heard of her at all. Yes, it was impossible not to understand such a hint, and the girl again warned him that he was risking his life if he blabber about what he saw today. But, unfortunately, it will no longer be possible to hide her shame, because two students who were looking for Julia still found her on the outskirts of the university. The worst thing was that they caught her just at the moment when the girl had not yet put on her underwear and was standing like that in front of Henry. The girls could hardly believe their eyes, and one immediately decided that Julia would soon marry this strange guy. Of course, it was her business, and the student immediately assured her that she wouldn't tell anyone, so Julia could rest easy. Looking at Henry, she made it clear that the guy was no slouch, since he was able to melt the heart of the strongest student of the academy. The guy smiled back and gave a thumbs up, deciding that he was lucky to be known as the one who got such an enviable bride. But everyone seemed to have forgotten to ask the opinion of Julia herself, who was not happy with their vile smiles and was ready to show it. Then it was as if an electric shock erupted from her, capable of killing any of these weak students. Even from under her soles, powerful bursts of energy were breaking through, and it became clear that another second, and Julia would give vent to her feelings. And so it happened, because she could not contain her emotions, and from the surge of her magic, bright rays flew in all directions from the place where they were standing. Out of fear, both students jumped up onto a tree, and Julia, looking at them, barely restrained herself from releasing all her strength.